Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Today on Ring of Fire, author and progressive talk show host Thom Hartmann is going to tell us why the next financial meltdown is right around the corner. And we'll examine the root causes of the current immigration crisis. We're going to find out how Republicans are blocking appointments from President Obama, causing agencies to be almost completely crippled. We have all that and more coming up. And right now, just remember, you've stepped in to the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
Some of the top economic minds were warning regulators that the economy was headed towards a complete collapse before the meltdown of 2008. And today, some of those same folks are warning us that our lack of effort is leading us down the same path of financial ruin. Joining me to talk about this is Thom Hartmann, progressive talk show host and author of the new book, The Crash of 2016. Thom, the article, Is America on the Verge of Another Financial Collapse, is just, of course, ties into your latest book. I don't think people understand some of the nuances to what's happening. This article, for example, talks about how banks now are borrowing from the government at 1% and then parking that same money in government treasuries at 3%. In other words, we're getting the government's giving them 1%, and then they're making money on the other end at 3%.
Yeah,
this is one of the small part, but lay out what you think are the fundamental parts of why this crash is imminent.
Well, because the fundamentals have not been fixed, and because we haven't gone a step beyond that and healed the damage that was done. When FDR came into office, you had absolute wreckage. I mean, the week he came into office in March of 1933, all the banks in America closed their doors. There's just pretty much all of them. I mean, it was just a total collapse. And so he pointed out, he said, there's all these people who've got these mortgages that they can't afford to pay. Now, back then, they were mostly 5-year mortgages with balloon payments. So he created an agency that bought those mortgages from the banks, turned them into 30-year notes, which cut the payments down to about a fifth of what they were. And over about a 40-year period, people paid that agency back. The government took about a 20% loss rate on those loans. And even at that, we made a profit. The government made a profit, saving individual homeowners. He said, to hell with the banks. We're going to save the homeowners. And the banking industry slowly got back together. As you pointed out, Pap, right now, people are scratching their heads. How could it be? Bernie Sanders and Dennis Kucinich got the Fed audited in 2008, and what they discovered was that the Fed had passed out over $30 trillion. The GDP of the United States is $15 trillion a year. The Fed had passed out over $30 trillion to banks, to rich people, to corporations all over the world. But at least $20 trillion of it was here in the United States. And they say, well, if the Fed passed out $20 trillion, how come we didn't get fixed? Well, the problem is the idea that was pitched by Tim Geithner and Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson and all these economic neocons was give the money to the banks. The banks will loan it to people. They'll give more favorable loan rates. If you give money to the banks at it's less than 1%, at 0.3%, 0.4%, 1%. Give the banks that money, and that banks will then be very, very happy to loan that money to homeowners at 3% or 4%, very low interest rates, to refinance bad loans, to even take write-offs on some of the principal, all these kind of things. In fact, there were some programs to incentivize banks to do that. And the bank said, screw that. We're going to sit on the money and make a fortune.
Thom, wasn't part of it also that we used to be a country that built things? We used to be a manufacturing company. And the idea was give banks money and we'll expand that issue. We will actually increase employment by building things like we used to and by manufacturing things rather than shipping them out of the country. Instead, we make these, you call it financialization, which is these fictions, these bank creations like swaps and CDOs and derivatives. That's where most of the money has gone, if it's been spent at all, isn't it? Productivity?
Yes, absolutely. When Reagan came into office, about 35% of our economy was manufacturing. Now it's between 11 and 15%, depending on whose numbers you're using. When Reagan came into office, banking was around 9% of our economy. Now it's around 35% of our economy. Banking doesn't make anything except for billionaires on Wall Street. And this whole financialization is crazy. And so, part of this is because of our trade policies. We used to have protectionist trade policies, which kept manufacturing in the United States. But another part of it is, once again, the theory was we will give the banks really, really cheap money, and they will lend that money out to companies, which will expand their manufacturing operations, hiring more people, stimulating the economy. The problem is that this was an extension of Reagan's supply-side economics. This theory assumes that if you build more factories and make more stuff, people will buy it. The reality is that economies, and Adam Smith laid this out in 1776 in his book, The Wealth of Nations, and his more important book, frankly, A Theory of Moral Sentiments. Adam Smith laid this out. Demand is what drives economies. Demand, people going into stores and saying, I want to buy something, which then causes the store owner to have to buy it from the wholesaler, who has to buy it from the manufacturer, who has to hire people to make it.
But they have to have wages to do that.
That's correct.
Tom,
the
you
thing
have
that
to
creates demand is wages. Wages is the 90% key component to demand.
Tom, one thing that you always hear about the threat of inflation, but honestly, when you analyze the things that's gotten us into the worst shape is stagflation. That's where, on both ends, the American public is getting it. Explain that a little bit. The argument about, you keep hearing, as amazing as it is, the notion, gee whiz, we've got to keep these interest rates down because we're so afraid of inflation.
Right.
And really, the argument, we have to keep these interest rates down because the banks own us.
Yeah. Part of this comes from a weird theology that's in Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged, which is that a currency that's backed up by the wealth and prosperity and good faith of a nation isn't as good as a currency that's backed up by gold, which is demonstrably false. But the other part is that people don't understand what causes inflation. The inflation of the 1970s, which led to stagflation, you had both inflation and a small recession at the same time. They called it stagflation. And really what caused that inflation was a lack of essential goods. This is what drives inflation. There's two kinds of inflation. There's inflation that's intentionally caused by a government debasing their currency. The only example of this in the 20th century that you can find that's really well documented, it was Germany after World War I. After World War I, at the Treaty of Versailles, and John Maynard Keynes fought this tooth and nail and said, this is crazy, you're going to cause World War II. After World War I at the Treaty of Versailles, the winning countries got together and said, we're going to punish Germany. They have to pay us back 2 trillion Deutschmarks. So Germany said, okay, cool. We have to pay you back 2 trillion Deutschmarks. We will make it so that 1 trillion Deutschmarks is enough to buy a loaf of bread. Here's your 2 trillion Deutschmarks. And that's what they did. They intentionally debased their currency so that they could meet the requirements of the Treaty of Versailles. That set up Hitler and the World War II. That happens so rarely that, maybe 4 times in the last 4 centuries you can find examples of that, even in small countries. It just almost never happens. The thing that actually causes the more common forms of inflation, like we had in the United States in the 1970s, like you have in Zimbabwe right now, where the inflation hit almost 10,000% a couple of years back, is shortage of critical materials. In Zimbabwe, it was food because they had just a disastrous farm policy. In the United States, it was oil when the Arabs declared an embargo on our oil during the Six-Day War and the subsequent, our subsequent support of Israel over the Arabs. And when that oil got cut off, the price of oil went up, right? Supply goes down, price goes up. And when the price went up, because oil is used by virtually every dimension of our economy, inflation happened. That's what causes inflation. And you deal with that by dealing with the commodity, the demand for the commodity. We should have, and Jimmy Carter correctly did, by the way, go back and listen to his speeches in 1978 and 79 about energy. We needed to move to a solar economy immediately. And Carter put into place in 79 a solar bank that he said by the year 2000, 20% of our electricity would be generated by electricity nationwide. It would have, too, if Reagan hadn't dismantled it.
Tom, I think your Crash of 2016 might be one of the most important books out there. That not to read it is not to understand what's getting ready to happen to you and your children and their grandchildren. I think it's so well done. And it's just something that should be required reading for anybody who really cares about the direction of this country. Thom Hartmann, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Pep. It's always an honor and pleasure to be with you.
Recently, President Obama called on the NFL and college football programs to do anything about the growing problem of football-related head injuries. Statistics show us that the number of serious injuries is on the rise. I have attorney Chris Seeger with me to talk about the problem and tell us what's being done to solve that problem. Chris, when you have an industry that is worth $9 billion and year in, year out, they're making billions and billions of dollars, it's hard to get them to pay attention to what they ought to be doing for the players. The NFL is the best example of what I'm talking about here. You just took that issue on. What did you find, Chris?
Well, I mean, I think what you just said is a fair conclusion that we came to, and we see it in every case. You know, at the end of the day, the players were commodities. And, you know, we brought this case initially, Mike, to get relief to the really sick players. What we found and what we learned in the process were that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of players that are really struggling with these head injuries. And we wanted to bring this case to get immediate relief to them and to make sure that we could get the players who are retired, who are asymptomatic today, get them tested and make sure that they're going to be okay.
One thing that I think the public missed about this case, I would hear some commentaries about it, and it's almost as if they didn't understand how impossible this case was, and then y'all pulled it off anyway. Talk about the obstacles that you had to overcome just to be able to get the sickest of the sick players. I mean, the people suffering from dementia, people suffering from Parkinson's-like disease, people that basically were paralyzed as a practical purpose from repeated concussions. How difficult was it to even get the NFL to pay attention to this?
You know, Mike, that's a really good question, and it's one that I haven't been asked yet, and I appreciate you asking that. You know, when I first looked at this case many years ago, I had players coming to me and complaining that they were being, you know, railroaded by the disability boards. They weren't being taken care of in the NFL and the Players Association in the benefits that were created. These guys were being rejected left and right. I looked at this case, and I initially considered rejecting it because I thought it was an incredibly difficult case. As I learned more about it and I saw what went on within the NFL, especially in the period of the early 90s to the early 2000s, the denial, not informing players of what was going on, and also, you know, basically having an anti-notice campaign, that is, publishing literature that went against the scientific literature. But they were still, notwithstanding that bad conduct, they were still difficult cases. And I remember about 2 or 3 weeks before we actually settled the case, there were commentators, professional commentators on the air saying we would never get a nickel. We would be fighting for years. These players would die before they'd see anything. Ironically, once we got the settlement, some of those very same commentators were arguing we didn't get enough. So
I remember that. I remember that very well. And I think as you look at this story, I think one thing that it did, this case has raised awareness not just for NFL, but for the for the child playing high school football or the college athlete. And now we know, I mean, there's no guesswork here, is there, Chris? There's no guesswork of what the science of this is. Although we saw the NFL try to buy what I call biostitutes, try to buy science by hiring scientists that would say any damn thing they wanted for the right amount of money. So that prevented any change. But now people are aware of what's going on, don't you think? That's a positive here, isn't it?
Mike, it's a positive. I think it's been a game changer on the concussion front. I have a young son who plays soccer. They're not teaching them at a young age to head the ball. They want to avoid concussions and subconcussive hits as well. They're teaching players to hit safely. By the way, money that we've obtained in the settlement, we're donating through the education fund we have to teaching young players how to hit safely to avoid these injuries. But maybe even more importantly for the players that are playing today, and I know that the public thinks of them as highly paid and they know what they're getting into, but we've made the rules of the game, I think, with this litigation, and also the NFL realizing this is the right thing to do. We've changed the rules in the game. These guys are not being put right back in the game after they've been knocked out.
Chris, let's even defend the players a little bit more. You always hear the argument, well, gee whiz, the players take this on. They're paid big money, and they run the risk. It's a little different story, though. When you really tell the truth about the story is players were asking questions. The question was, look, I've had 3 concussions, team doctor. Would you tell me, does this mean anything? And the same damn team doctor would go out and write an article about how it doesn't mean anything, how it's a transient injury, there's no problem. Basically what was happening is the players were being lied to in a very organized kind of way by these scientists that they would find at a university making $100,000 a year, and they'd say, how would you like to make $500,000 for writing a paper that is an absolute absolute lie. And so that's kind of in defense of the player that says, well, gee, they lied to me.
Once again, you nailed it. I mean, they had a guy that they put in charge of their mild traumatic brain injury committee who wasn't even a neurologist. He was a rheumatologist. And this rheumatologist was able to recruit other scientists. And they did exactly what you just said. They put their names on papers saying there are none of these diseases are related to concussions. So even if the player wanted to find out the risks, there would be this published literature out there that denied, let's call it independent medical science. So you're absolutely right on that. And the players, look, let's be frank also. They may have bargained for a lot of pain. They know they're playing a rough game. They're big, they're strong, they're athletic, they're hitting each other. But they bargained for neck injuries. They bargained for knee injuries, back injuries. I don't think these guys knew that they were the kind of damage they were doing to their brain.
I think the startling thing about it is you hear these stories that they emerge one at a time, where you have a player that is suffering from depression. They have illnesses that look like Alzheimer's disease. When they do an autopsy on the brain, it looks like a brain of an 85-year-old man. That individual ends up committing suicide, and they're seeing this more and more in the NFL. And I guess the point is, it's all about choice, isn't it? Don't you at least give the player the choice to say, listen, you can do this and you can make millions of dollars, but you're not going to live as long. B, if you do live long, you're not going to have a quality of life that's worth a damn. And it's all about simply having the decency to give them choice. And we ought to do the same thing. And this is what your lawsuit, I think, has been so incredibly important. It's incredibly important to let parents know that when you put that child out on the field, you're being lied to by the manufacturing of the helmets sometime, aren't you?
Yeah, and Mike, I think you just nailed it. The importance of this case was to try to get back to a way of playing the game that avoids the head-to-head collisions. And if you're going to do that, that's fine. But like you just said, it is a matter of choice. And look, there are a number of players that have been interviewed by the press that have said, I understand now everything there is to know about concussions, the diseases they lead to, and I wouldn't do a thing different. That's okay. That does not undermine what we did. What we're talking about is that when you're putting people in harm's way, when you're giving them a drug that causes injuries, when you're putting them on the football field, you just tell them the truth.
And if you tell them the truth and then they make that decision, that's perfectly understandable. But here the most important thing is at least the parents who make the decision to let that child play football understand, A, there is a way to play it safely, and B, understand with your eyes wide open that you may suffer consequences in later years. Just give them the choice. If they then choose to do that, that's what this lawsuit really is all about. Chris Seeger, again, great work. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much.
Rick Perry is using the current wave of young immigrants coming into America to attack President Obama, but he completely ignores the fact that his Republican Party has blocked every attempt at any kind of meaningful immigration reform. I have Howard Nations with me to tell us what's happening with immigration in the United States today. Howard, Zoe Carpenter with The Nation magazine did a great article on crisis at the border that I thought we could talk about. The border issue is so misunderstood for so many reasons. On one side, you have the hate hype. And the hate hype is they're bringing in disease, they're bringing in gangbangers, they're coming through our borders in droves to basically undermine our justice system. On the other side of the hate, the hate crazies, you have a part of the public that simply doesn't understand what in the hell is going on down there in the border. What's your take on this whole thing?
Well, the nature of the crisis is purely humanitarian. The fact is that Honduras, El Salvador, and Ecuador are the three countries that these children, unaccompanied, are coming in from. And the reason they're fleeing is they're fleeing drug trafficking murders in their countries. Honduras, which is the size of New York City, has 20 murders a day. Compared to New York City, Honduras has 7,300 murders a year. New York City, which is the same population, has 333. Biggest murder capital in the world. Ecuador is the number 2 murder capital in the world. So people are sending their kids away.
These are real issues. Zoe Carpenter, when she talked about this article in The Nation, laid out what humanitarian means, and you wonder, is it real? And if you listen to what Zoe Carpenter has to say, your opinion is, from what you're reading, is it is real. This is actually humanitarian. The drug cartels are so out of control that it's just murder in the streets. Any of us can pick up the newspaper and we see, people beheaded. We see dozens of people buried beheaded and buried. We see them hanging on meat spikes, all these types of ugly visuals. So the question now, here's where people are concerned. And I think I have a hard time arguing with this. Is it just coming over the border to us, you see? Isn't that what we really have to answer? In other words, the hate frenzy is one thing, and that the hate frenzy has no analysis about it. The hate frenzy is we simply have these immigrants. But the real question then becomes, are we now seeing the cartels simply moving north with a population? What's your take?
Well, this population that's moving north right now is 40 to 50,000, mostly unaccompanied minors, and they are fleeing from the drug cartels. This all goes back, it's been going on for a number of years, and what happened, the background on this is that in 2008, President Bush and the Republicans were seriously seeking the Hispanic vote. So they passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was designed to protect victims who are from countries that do not have borders with the United States. That's El Salvador, Honduras, and the exact people that are coming in right now.
Guatemala and all, yeah.
Yeah, Guatemala. The Hispanics then voted 70% for Obama, so Obama is now trying to enforce that act that the Republicans passed and Bush signed, and he's enforcing it. He's seeking $3.7 billion to enforce it, and the Republicans are refusing to fund it.
Well, okay, but let's the people at the border who have their homes there, their businesses there, they're seeing, they're the ones who get most information about what's going on just 50 miles over the border, where you have these horrendous atrocities taking place sometimes. And so I think the only approach here seems to be what Obama is saying, and that is Obama has come out and said, look, I think he said we need $3 billion just to solve the problem. We got to have money to be able to figure out what's real and what's not. Is there some truth to the people, some of the people that are kind of involved in kind of nefarious quality acts? It's easy to say, yeah, they're all children, but they're not all children. So Obama says, well, we got to figure that out. But now you have Congress that says, we're not even going to give you the money to do that. This is your problem now. Solve it with executive order. Isn't that kind of where this thing is moved to?
Yeah, and here's the problem. The law is the problem. Border security is not the problem. The law requires that Health and Human Services give due process hearings to each of these people that come in like this. They're required to have judges, they have to have lawyers, and the process could take years. They're trying to prove whether or not they're actually fleeing in fear of their life and have legitimate danger from their home countries, which these children do. That's where the money comes in. And so it's not about border security. Obama met this week with Governor Perry from Texas. Perry's response he said he had 3 great ideas for handling this problem. 1, he wants to send in surveillance drones. 2 is he wants to send in 1,000 National Guardsmen, and he couldn't remember what the third one was. But Perry is the commander-in-chief of the National Guard. If he wants to send 1,000 National Guardsmen down there, he can.
But what does that do What does that do, Howard, if you have a law that was passed by the Republicans that says this is what you have to do before you can take anybody and send them back over the border? Now, again, this wasn't Obama's law. This was Republicans' law. So Obama's now saying, well, okay, that's the law. Either change the law immediately, okay, with some kind of retro aspect to it, or give me the money so we can have these kinds of hearings that your president, Mr. Republicans, have put in place. Isn't that kind of the distillation of this?
that is the distillation of it. And when you get back to the Congress, what's happening with Boehner, Jack Kennedy wrote a great book called Profiles in Courage. If they ever write a book called Profiles in Cowardice, Boehner gets the cover.
Yeah.
Here's a guy who is suing the president for exceeding his authority for executive action. At the same time, in this case, he's criticizing the president for no executive action. The United States Congress wants immigration reform. 68 senators passed it. 5 House committee chairs have cleared it. And Boehner refuses to have a floor vote. Why?
Well,
because he's afraid of the Tea Party caucus within his own party, afraid he can't keep his own job.
Well, let me just tell you this. We've seen executive orders take place in crises a lot less than this. This is a crisis. Yeah. There's no question about it. They keep coming by the tens of thousands. There's only so much we can absorb quickly. And so it wouldn't surprise me if, hopefully this president will say, look, I can't get money from Congress to have these hearings that the Republicans said they had to have. I can't get money from Congress to put in place anything long term. So I immediately have to take executive action because it's a national emergency. And I think he'd be totally justified. Howard, thank you for joining us. Let's continue talking about this story because it's not one that is easily dealt with. This is one that's going to be around quite a long time.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Republicans in Washington are determined to make President Obama a complete failure, and one of the best techniques has been to block his nominees to vital positions in government. They've even blocked nominees that they support just despite the president. Joining me now to talk about the problem is David Hirsch. David, the nullification agenda we've heard about, you hear it in the press sometimes. How is nullification taking place? How is it that our government has come to a standstill, besides the obvious that you've got a bunch of wingnuts running the House of Representatives that simply I really don't think they have the intellect to do anything. But what's your take on how this nullification has taken place, how we can't move?
You know, Pap, it's amazing. We have what is being termed by scholars to be the new nullification. It's a process in the Congress where delay, the four corners, running the clock out, attempting to delay so that nothing gets done is the strategy that's being pursued. It's very much like the four corners in basketball that folks may be familiar with. Before there was a shot clock, all you had to do was consistently delay and delay and delay, and that way you could prevent the other team from doing anything. We're seeing partisan politics taken on at a new level here in our Congress. For example, at the present time, as of the end of May of this year, our president had 139 nominees who were pending on the Senate floor for confirmation. Now, we're talking about judicial nominees, executive nominees, nominees for administrative posts. In contrast, at this time, President Bush had a small fraction of that, less than 40. President Clinton had even less than that, less than 20. We see that of those that are executive branch or agency nominees, the people that really run the government, do the stuff that government needs to do, we have over 110 that has simply been pending, many of them for, on average, 9 months, and many of them for 2, 3 years, while the agencies come to a complete grinding halt and a standstill and nothing gets done.
Let me walk you back in time just a little bit. When we started seeing the gerrymandering taking place, where the Republicans, by way of Karl Rove strategy, said, listen, it doesn't really matter all that much what happens in Washington, as long as back here in our backyard, state by state, we can gerrymander to at least gain control of the House. Now, understand, once you're in control of the House, that's how you stop all of this. So what did they do? Every single Republican governor that was elected, 28 of them at one time, then it was ultimately 32, every one of them had a gerrymander plan. Now, they're being held unconstitutional in some places. Florida, for example, they said, no, that's not constitutional because they had gerrymander plans that looked like amoebas and, spaghetti, pieces of spaghetti. But the point is this, that's what they wanted to do. That was about nullification. You see, if you control the House and put these wingnuts in there, then you're able to nullify everything that's supposed to move ahead. Judges, appointments to the EPA, and that's exactly what this has come down to, isn't it?
It's exactly what it's come down to, and I think one of the most compelling analyses on this is if you look at the number of times that through the use of gerrymandering, through the use of this nullification process, there have been obstructionist tactics, the delays on voting for cloture, the process by which you finally get a nomination voted on, where you have cloture delays that last for months or years, and when the candidate is finally up for final approval, they get unanimous approval because no one's really opposed to them. 13 judges, for example, that have been gone finally to vote since November of last year, had cloture fights, delay fights, tactical delays, but when it came time to give a up or down, a yes or no on these people, everybody unanimously voted for them. So it's not a matter of there's something wrong with the person, there's something wrong with the nominee. It's a matter of we're going to delay at all costs, at all times, regardless of how it impacts government. And of course, then government grinds to a halt. Nothing happens.
David, we heard about the threat of the nuclear option, and then Harry Reid came out, and he was very good at negotiating the cloture rule, which says this. It says it no longer takes 60 votes to bring cloture, that you can do it with 51. Now, that was an important move, but he only did that where it came to certain appointments. It didn't even include appointments to the U.S. Supreme Court. It didn't include things like the the House Finance Agency, which is critical to having an appointment made there, or the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. It didn't apply to that. There's so many places there were these big flaws in place. And now, isn't it time for Harry Reid to go back and say, you know what, Republicans, we know that you believe that you have hijacked government by gerrymandering the House of Representatives. So we're going to hijack your attempt to hijack by going forward with a nuclear option that's going to affect everything. Don't you think it's time for Harry Reid to do that right now?
I believe it's clearly time for us to do that because we've got to get these public servants. And Pap, that is what they are. They're hired, they're elected to serve and to govern. It's time to get them out of a position of naysaying and saying no and running our government the way it needs to be run. We have agencies. The Election Assistance Commission, which both parties agree is essential to avoiding voter fraud.
Critical,
which has no board members and hasn't ever had any since it was approved because of these delays. We have Veterans Affairs where we can't get executive directors. We have Housing and Urban Development, Education Department, NASA. We can't get executive directors in these places. It's not because these people aren't qualified. It's not because the work that needs to be done is not important. It's because the game plan is to nullify and say no. It's time, as you say, for the nuclear option. Let's blow this sucker up and make it work.
As you know, I'm not a big fan of either the Democrats or the Republicans. I'm an independent voter, have been for a very long time. But in this situation, I simply have to say it is the Republicans that have stopped government. And the reason it's clear that that's what's happened is that was their agenda. When Karl Rove said we have to win by gerrymandering, that's what he meant. We have to change policy in the country that is conservative, crazy nut policy by shutting down the government. And to do that, we have to go state by state and gerrymander all Democrats out to the benefit of only Republicans. And if we put the Republicans in the House of Representatives, they're going to stop all that. And short of a nuclear option, I don't see what else we're going to do here, David.
I don't see any other option. And the fact of the matter is, and it goes back, Pap, to the point I made earlier, which is that on the individuals who ultimately do get through the process, ultimately or get past cloture and they go to a vote, many, the vast majority of them, either are approved unanimously or by a supermajority, which means that it's not really about them. So the delay, the tactics that are used for this nullification is nothing more than expression of what Karl Rove and his minions have put in place through the Republicans to delay and to obfuscate and to prevent government from working as part of their tactics. And that's got to stop.
And it's killing democracy. David Hirsch, thank you for joining me, okay?
Thanks, Pap.
The GOP has always been the anti-science Republican Party, and recently they've brought the fight against scientific advancement into the House of Representatives. Joining me now to talk about the House Science Committee's war on science is attorney Karen Evans. Karen, what's very apparent is that you have a science committee with the House of Representatives that has just declared war on intelligence. I mean, it's not just science, it's on just absolute intelligence.
I couldn't agree more, Mike. I don't understand how one GOP control committee is waging war on science. It seems like there should be something that we should be able to do to stop that, because it creates, what I think it's creating is a public safety hazard. Because we've got folks who now are trying to basically usurp the role of the EPA and all the scientists and the science behind that organization, and it's going to create a public health situation for Americans.
Well, I think one way that they accomplish that, Karen, if you think about it, it begins by them being shameless. I mean, it's almost as if they aren't concerned about what the image is. The hearings that they've had on the climate change, it's looked like a frat boy. Festival. I mean, a festival of ignorance, where you have this cast of Animal House-like characters without brains attacking real life scientists that have all of the information that shows that global climate change is real. 97% of all the credible scientists say it's real. But it looks like a frat boy setting, as if they don't have any shame. Isn't that kind of your impression here?
That's absolutely my impression. And the problem with that, though, is that, one, it's an embarrassment. It's a national embarrassment, because I don't think America is alone in this quest that climate change is a result of human activity. And so to have our House of Representatives and this committee speaking in such a way, it makes America look terrible. It's a national embarrassment.
It's always money, isn't it? I mean, if you really drill down here, Karen, this is about money again, isn't it?
It is absolutely about money. It's not about science at all. And it should be about science. I think what we're talking about is that it should be about green science and not green money. And that's what it comes down, because we've got Republicans and a GOP agenda which is running amok, all for the sake of trying to continue with their fraternization and over-influence, I would say, by industry, those in the oil, coal, and natural gas businesses. And that's going to impact on Americans, and in fact, our world as we know it. I want the world to be around when my son and my son's children are alive. And I want it to be a world in which we can live and not be sickened by the air that we breathe and the water that we drink.
Well, you almost have to wonder whether these buffoons that are running this science committee in the House of Representatives even have a family. Because if you have a child, how do you possibly sit there and talk this idiot talk? How do you possibly do that?
I don't understand it, because it is science. I don't know they have no credible studies that rebut the science that we're relying on for these regulations that we are trying to enact. And I think it's a shame that a committee like this would, one, try to get involved into, well, let me just say it this way. Politics should not be involved in science. Science should be non-political, and it should be based on peer review and evidence-based science, not politics. And that's what the problem is right now.
You have a good many critics coming out, and I'm just wondering what your reaction to this is that, yes, it is the money. The lobbyists have taken over the committee. And as a matter of fact, you see a lot of committee members leaving the committee and going to work for the industry.
Right.
But isn't the other part of it, you hear critics saying that maybe they are just and this is not my words, but you hear these exact words in one form or fashion, and that is maybe they're just too stupid to be evil. That these representatives, they're hugely out of Texas, hugely out of Arkansas, Oklahoma, all the oil states, that maybe they really are too stupid. Maybe they didn't learn science themselves. What is your reaction to that? I mean, and these people, this criticism is not flippant criticism. It is they genuinely don't understand what they're talking about.
Well, I don't claim to be an expert, but I've read about this, and I think within an hour of reading from real science, you understand the issue. And so I don't think it's real stupidity. I think it's greed, and I think it's their desire to push the GOP agenda without really thinking about the long-term impact that this is going to have on our world.
Well, don't we have, I want your reaction on this. I've been fairly critical of this president, even though I did everything I could to get him elected twice. I still feel like we have to stand up and be critical at the right time. Isn't there a lot of things that this president can do by way of executive order to override what's happening in the Republican-held House of Representatives?
I would think that he should be able to do things, but he's been so thwarted in his efforts that I don't really know about that. I would hope that he could do something. I know that he should do something.
Well, you're right up there in Washington, D.C., and you see the Environmental Protection Agency under assault. You see the National Science Foundation under assault. And it's always the same people that are saying, let's close down the EPA, let's close down the National Science Foundation. And it's always somebody who's working for the Republican Party and working for the oil industry at the same time.
Absolutely. And that over-influence is affecting policy. And this committee, above all committees, because it's the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, should be about objective data and not partisan politics. And the fact that the GOP is pushing this agenda through this committee is very troublesome. It's very troublesome because we've got non-elected staffers creating policy that is derived not for the benefit of the public, but for the benefit of these industry influences. We've got these congressmen taking all this money from oil and gas and coal, and it's influencing the politics, which are now impacting public safety.
Yeah. Karen Evans, thank you for joining me, okay?
Thank you for having me.
So, Pap, this week we saw a phenomena that, I don't even know how to really describe this other than it is just sheer ignorance on parade. And there was a story out in Salon, which I'm sure you saw, which noted that the British government last week basically said that in their schools, they have clarified and extended laws banning creationism in the classroom to not only free schools, but to academies as well. In other words, private and public schools. We know the BBC this week also said they're not going to have climate deniers on their news programs because these people are freaks. But in this country, we can't seem to get there at all.
Well, I mean, there's so many parts to this story. First of all, the part is that this media, as we've said so many times, has become just so, corporate media is so dysfunctional. I mean, this idea where we are an open-minded entity and we will talk about any part of any argument, and they do that just because the MBAs up on the 50th floor that are doing the advertising and all, They can't stand any kind of criticism at all, even when the criticism is just crazy and bizarre. So in other words, if there was a debate about whether the sun evolved around the Earth, you'd have the people saying, no, the sun evolves around the Earth doesn't evolve around the sun. You would allow those people on the show because that is the nature of the new media.
And we know in the case of CNBC, when that report about the risk factors involving climate change to businesses was released, they were out not just openly
hustling
saying we're
stories,
open.
yeah.
They were soliciting someone to write a climate denial story.
Okay, so what is that about? First of all, it's about money. It's about the fact that corporate news is no more corporate news. There's no more news infrastructure anymore. Right. Okay, that's the important thing. So the BBC story said, look, we don't want to be like America. Okay, we read the landmark UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Changes, IPCC. We read it. You know, we're not idiots. 95% of the people of the scientists said that it is absolutely climate change is taking place and humans are responsible. 95%. So we don't have to allow some fool on the air to talk about something stupid. So that was a strong statement. Sam, it's so bad in the United States right now. I mean, this anti-intellectualism has become so bad. You have 5 southern states that are trying to make their kids scientifically illiterate. Did you see this story?
Yes. First off the bat, of course, is Louisiana, where Governor Bobby Jindal and the proliferation of private schools and vouchers in that state is basically subsidizing a huge portion of the population down there to go to these parochial schools, which teach creationism, which basically say we're not going to even teach evolution. It's just the planet's 6,000 years old. Humans have been here, just popped up 6,000 years ago in basically the same form that we're in now. I guess we were wearing fig leaves instead of shirts and pants, and that's basically it. You've got Missouri, where they have advanced a bill in the Missouri House. It is bill number 1472 that would allow parents to opt their children out of class during lessons about evolution.
Why is it always the southern states? Look, if you think about this story, Sam, the Scopes trial, and this great, by the way, great article in Salon.com. Dan Arrow wrote a great article on this idea of how we're dumbing down our children on purpose. But in 1925, the Scopes trial took place, the monkey trial, where they said, the issue was can you teach evolution? And so fast forward 2005, a U.S. District Court says that intelligent design is bunk, that it's not science at all, that it's creationism is not science at all, and that we don't to teach that would be unconstitutional. Okay. So as you point out, Louisiana said, well, we're not going to, we're going to ignore science. We're going to ignore it because it's comfortable for us. And then Missouri said the same thing. Louisiana said the same thing. Oklahoma, how about this? Oklahoma faced 2 attempts, all-out, full-scale attempts to have anti-evolution bills to where you couldn't teach evolution in school. That's how bad it was there in Oklahoma.
And people should remember, we're focusing on states and bills that are starting to make their way through these various state houses, and they may or may not get passed. But how many times in the past, Pap, have we talked about some guy who we thought was marginal, who was in one of these southern states, who was promoting some legislation, and then 2, 3, 4 years later, this becomes the Republican, this becomes their platform. And so we have seen this. What we were talking a year or two ago, the idea that somehow a corporation could be Christian in and of itself, even though basically it's in the business of selling pipe cleaners and popsicle sticks.
And googly eyes.
Right. The idea that they could be Christian and their Christian belief as a corporation would be offended because they are offering health insurance that provides no copays for contraceptives.
But the point,
we all thought that was a joke.
Okay, and the point being is the Republicans were smart enough to start picking off intelligence state by state. Obviously, you start in places like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Oklahoma, So I mean, I don't know how crazy it's going to get, but if you take it's always the southern states,
Yep.
Sam. It's always you follow any of these stories. It's always the southern states because right now they're Republican governors, Republican legislators. They're in charge of what happens in that state. I mean, my God, look at North Carolina right now. It's just a disaster.
And of course, this is a long-term movement that has sort of reemerged over the past 10, 15, 20 years in this country. We know data has shown that there are teachers across the country, particularly in the South, who are literally afraid to teach evolution because they're afraid they're going to get in trouble with their
Well, they're going to get fired.
Yeah, exactly. And you know,
Scopes trial all over again.
And there was a story in the New York Times this week about two studies. One was the Pew Research poll, which shows that 33% of the public believes that humans and other living things have existed in their present form since the beginning of time. 26% think there is not solid evidence that the average temperature on Earth has been getting warmer over the past few decades. And of course, this breaks down along ideological and partisan lines. Now, before you get the idea that we can offer facts, and this will change people's minds, that's actually just the opposite. People get their positions hardened when they are faced with facts. And there was a new study by a Yale Law School professor that found that the divide in belief of evolution between more or less religious people is wider amongst people who otherwise are familiar with math and science. In other words, those people who are more educated are actually wider apart on their belief system because it is, for them, a cultural identifier.
Yeah, okay, for example, the cultural identifier, I think, look, the Tea Party rednecks right now are turning their diesel trucks into these polluting smokestacks. You know the story, the rolling coal story.
The coal rollers.
The coal rollers. Okay, what is that about? Is that they are so dramatically stupid by choice? Or is it that they are so dramatically stupid by culture? Or is it they are so dramatically stupid because they simply are afraid to acknowledge the truth? I mean, there's a lot of complicated issues there, but here in the South, and it's a Southern story, you've got them modifying their diesel trucks. They turn their
pickup trucks,
their pickup trucks into these churning black smoke stacks. And the idea is they ride up and down neighborhoods, and the smoke is thick black smoke. I mean, and the statement is, we'll do whatever the hell we want to because we're idiot rednecks and we live in the South and we don't have to follow any federal emissions issues. And
they call it Prius repellent. They think that they are sending a message to environmentalists, to people in hybrid cars, to President Obama. I mean, this is how demented they are, by basically billowing this black smoke on bicycle riders. And this is exactly.
But you know where this started,
about.
Don't you? I mean, you actually had, if you go back and you look through the conservative blogs, this actually started industry trying to make this kind of a cute little ha-ha.
Right.
So
exactly.
Industry is always behind. In other words, first of all, I doubt many of them would be creative enough to even come up with some type of belligerent protest like that. So it has started with where you'd expect, with industry. But now, all of a sudden, it's taken off as this fad, and you'll see these big 150 pickup trucks with these big smokestacks and diesel engines and just black smoke, spewing out of the top of the stack, just to say, hell with everybody who has any brains. I'm a Southern redneck idiot, and I'm going to do this because I choose to do it.
And the problem here is that they are so. This is so much about embracing an identity, and it is. We could go on for hours about why they are doing this. It's a function of them having a hard time and them being fed something to hang on to as
for their identity.
Right, exactly.
That further secures their identity.
And it makes me think of this story that came out in a book, and I spoke to the author of this book actually on our weekday show, Pap. This guy Mike Tipping, I should say. And there is documented evidence that Governor Paul LePage in Maine met over the course of 9 months. He met 8 times with a group of sovereign citizens for about 16 hours. And they were basically telling him that they were, these are basically the Clive and Bundy folk, basically telling him that he could perhaps assassinate political opponents, that that they are all individual attorney generals. I mean, it got so bad.
Well, they were sovereign citizens. First of all, the sovereign citizens have killed just almost 20 police officers just in about the last 30 or 40 months.
LePage
20
knew,
police officers, sovereign citizens. We've talked about them before. They're,
LePage knew that they have been designated as a terrorist organization
Right.
by the FBI.
Right.
He continued to meet with them, so much so that his own lawyers ended up drafting a 5-page document to prove to him that everything that they were telling this guy over the course of 9 months was a lie, because they basically had to get involved with an intervention, because this LePage guy, this sitting governor of a state, was believing all of these things that these sovereign citizens were saying, and his advisors were freaking out because they were getting worried about this.
Well, they're talking about hanging Democrats. I mean, literally lynching Democrats. This governor said, the governor goes and talks about how they're talking about hanging Democrats. And I mean, but the point is, to say that in some setting, probably joking, but here you're talking to sovereign citizens. These are the people who don't have driver's license. They don't pay taxes. They say they are their own. They're their own sovereign. They're their own country. They create their own license plates. These are the same people that almost every few months you pick up. They've murdered police officers because they're so anti-government. I mean, just these last police officers murdered in California.
Right.
That's who they were. They're sovereign citizens.
Those Jaron and Amanda
Exactly.
Miller. And again, Pap, this gets back to your point about industry. The one thing that these sovereign citizens all need, of course, is as much guns as they can possibly get. And many of their theories are propagated by the NRA, essentially,
of course,
so that they can create this type of paranoia.
Go to Montana, get a cellar, hide yourself, collect your food. They're survivalist kind of mentality.
Exactly. And what we see here is that culmination of cultural identification, mix it in with what various industries want to sell these people, and that's essentially what we are facing in this country right now, is this hardened group of people who there's a lot of money to be made by keeping these people so wrapped up in their pathologies.
And where did they originate? Got to say it. Alabama. That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringofireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.